wake of the demolitions we've seen this week and previous years, especially after flood disasters, we asked, are demolitions of structures, either in waterways or illegally sited, the best way to deal with Accra's flooding crisis? A, yes. B, no. The results will surprise you. Now, the president has listed a number of measures to prevent a recurrence of the floods. He talks about them. He talks about, for example, demolition of structures. In fact, that is the first one. To quote him, he says, clearing of illegal structures obstructing our waterways has begun. And we saw the evidence of that this week, where the ministers were going all around the country, pulling down some structures, authorizing that they stop at Odododio, for example. They pulled down several structures there. The question really is that the solution?
Not really. I mean, I think that demolition is the low-hanging fruit. It makes for good television. It's easy to make it appear that there's action. But I think, in my own estimation, it's going to be negligible in terms of overall impact of flooding.
So it's not going to solve the problem. It's going to be it's not going to be enough, I guess.
Well, look at it this way. I mean, the people that put up sort of very haphazard structures in flood-prone areas next to rivers and things like this, those constructions are generally not strong enough to resist flood events. So they're actually the most vulnerable. They'll get caught up in any kind of heavy flood event, and that's why there's so much destruction. So they're much more the most vulnerable than they are really the problem. And I couldn't agree more with what Kingsley said, is that we have to look at this at a much larger scale. I mean, and I think we're going to get into it because it's obviously a very complex issue. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yes.
But it's much larger. And I think particularly those communities and areas which are very much at the end of this entire sort of river system, they're not causing the problem whatsoever.
Okay, so we'll come back to you and talk about, so what is causing the problem? I think Kingsley's diagnosis there is the drains, first of all, aren't wide enough and properly designed, and therefore, well, it's not helping much. I don't know what your diagnosis is, but I will talk about that very shortly. James, you believe, well, pulling down structures, easy way out, everybody can do it, but that's not really the problem. I think you agree with that also.
No, I think, Evans, I agree, but I'll first of all start by expressing my deepest condolence
for the people
who are dead, and speedy recovery to those ones that are recovering from the burns. I think basically the demolition is one of those knee-jerk reactions in this country. Most of these filling stations you see around usually go through a very rigorous process in terms of acquiring their lines. I'm talking about the legal ones that are not so. First step, you need about 5 permits, Evans, to basically
for a filling station,
for a full service station.
And the reason why that is important is the first casualties we saw when it came to the building, the structures, were the filling stations. Why? Because Gore filling station had exploded and killed about 100 people.
Precisely.
But you say, well, it's a bit more complex than to say a filling station is there in the midst of the community to pull it out.
See, all of a sudden, filling stations have become evil in this country. And instead of rather looking at the issues that caused, the explosion, we are all on demolition of filling stations. Look, a filling station, all the filling stations you see, need permits, 5 basic permits. The fire permit, the town and country planning permit, in terms of the zoning, whether it's a mixed, a commercial or residential filling station. Then you submit all the fire and the zoning permit to the EPA, and they then do an environmental impact assessment. After that, you go to the assembly, the district assembly or whatever it is, for a building permit. Then after that one, you submit all these documents, the fire, the block plan, the zoning, and also the EPA, to the MPA before you see any filling station.
So it's a very complex process.
It's a very complex process. It takes at least not less than 6 months. Is it
possible that some people are circumventing that process?
Precisely. You see, Evans, if critically, if you look at the issues, okay, you realize that, look, no matter, it boils down to regulations and safety measures at the various filling stations. The filling station that got burnt at Circle has been there since 1962.
Yeah, so we had this week.
1962, and then
it predates all the other buildings that came around.
Precisely, and so you realize that it boils down to regulations, and then you realize that even if you put filling stations in the forest, okay, and we don't take measures to stop this flood, disasters will still occur in Ghana.
Kingsley.
Let me have an intake. I've done some analysis of what happened, and I want us to look at it this way.
Let's talk about it.
Good. You know these filling stations, almost all of them has their valves, the how do you call it, the inlet valves for filling the underground tanks in a manhole. You understand? Now, suppose the area floods. Eventually, the water will go into the manholes. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, these valves are not airtight. You understand?
Those we have locally?
Yes. Okay. Most of the filling stations, the inlets, the valves are sitting in a manhole, and they are not airtight. What it means is that should water just fill up the manhole, water will just go into the reservoir. Is that right? Good. You and me know that the density of water is greater than the density of petrol.
So when it makes one will rise to the top.
Good. The moment the valve is not airtight and water floods within the manhole, water begin to cruise into the manhole. Is that right?
And mix with the fuel.
No, when the water begins to enter the tank, it will eject the fuel out because the fuel has to go on top.
The water will descend to the bottom.
Good. It will displace the fuel. And so that was how I suspect that the fuel started coming up. Because water was entering the tank. And of course, people started smelling fuel. Yeah. What it meant was that fuel was started gushing out to the tank.
Is that a standard? So the valve is where you're putting...
Yes. So I think that the construction of some of these valves should be airtight, and then of course if it can be constructed so that it is higher than the level of the ground, if the valves come come up a little, so that whether it floods or not, there's no way water is going to enter the tank underground.
The connection to the underground is above ground level.
It should be above ground level because
how high? But how high can you go?
Well, it's relative.
Precisely.
You see
how high the flats will be. You see, there's one thing we need to. You see, it's about, as I said earlier on, it's about regulation. You see, people who are crying about these service stations have cylinders in their rooms, LP gas cylinders in their rooms.
But the issue is if the valves are not airtight, you understand?
The new ones are airtight now.
Well, then what it means is that water can always get into the tank. You understand?
I get you.
And so the option is either we make them airtight or we elevate them a little high above the ground relatively, so that should there be any flood, there will be no entry of water into the
quickly, I don't know what you make of this conversation about the filling stations. You've traveled widely. I don't know what is the standard elsewhere.
Sure. I mean, I would say I won't pretend to know all the intricacies of the engineering works of a filling station, but I mean, I would say maybe two things. One is that I mean, if you did want to elevate these inlets to a higher level, I mean, as Kingsley would know, I mean, one thing that you can do is that based off of historical data and also sort of climate modeling, you can talk about 100-year flood events, and you can understand in terms of the geography of the land, and from that sort of extrapolate what you're looking for in sort of extreme flood events. And so conceivably you could use that kind of technical approach to introduce a measure like that if it made sense according to sort of standards. I mean, I think on the other hand, even if you were to do that, I think, let's be honest, is that even if you elevate the inlet, there's always an opportunity that a tank can potentially leak somewhere else, and you could have some kind of leakage elsewhere underground. So in a way, I almost feel like it might make sense. I mean, I suspect this is based off of sort of international approaches, but that even if the connection is underground, I think then it just comes back to regulation and enforcement and being able to quickly identify and access, and be able to go down and sort of work on this seems to me maybe good, as opposed to sort of sealing the whole thing underground with no ability to sort of access it.
But with most filling stations, the tanks are not lying and horizontally, they are tilted. So there's always an observation well that every day when they get to work, they dip in. So you will know. You see, for example, if I deliver 10,000 liters at your filling station, and I come back and I only receive sales for 8,000, there's a negative variance. Nobody would like to lose money when it comes to, because fuel is money. Nobody would like to lose it. So when it comes to, and MPA also does pressure checking every 3 years for all the stations. So from my perspective, I think what they can do now, what the investigative team can do, is to go to the MPA, take the latest report, because they regularly go to the stations, the stations that we handle and those ones that we manage. The MPA goes there regularly. You know, so they should pick they should start the investigations by picking the report.
We've heard this week that they're going to be a nationwide audit of filling stations. But let's talk about the broader question of why we've been having these floods over the years, and nobody seemed to answer that question. We've had the knee-jerk reactions of pulling down structures, etc. DK, what's your own understanding of why we keep on having this problem? You worked. I think we'll pick on that experience in eastern Nigeria and use that to see how that compares with us. But first, tell me what you've noticed, probably the problem, why we're having this problem.
So, I mean, I would say that, I mean, everyone knows it's a problem, and everyone knows it's a serious problem, and it's a recurring problem. And I think that we need to sort of have a radical change in how we look at water, essentially. And, you know, historically, water was seen as, water within urban environments was seen as a civil engineering problem. And essentially, you solved it essentially with concrete. You know, you make some calculations and then you decide how big your culverts should be and your drains and your cross sections and all these kinds of flow rates and things like that. And then you try to concretize all of the sort of natural rivers and water ecosystems, essentially into gutters of various size, some being obviously enormous. But over recent decades, there's been a rethinking of that approach, and I mean it's still emerging in terms of how you call it. But some people call it landscape urbanism. Some people call it ecological urbanism. But basically, it's a recognition that rivers and waters and streams are ecosystems, and you can't just replace them with a concrete channel and expect everything to be perfect. So I think that if we really and truly, I think as a people, as citizens of Accra, wanted to adjust this, we have to break the concrete and sort of return a natural environment into the city.
Because the president talks about designing efficient drainage systems. Are you saying that's not really the solution? Because that would be the concrete work, in fact, building the
Okay, I mean, so I would say two things. I mean, one is that, you know, if you take the civil engineering route, it's actually quite, again, very complex, because there are areas of Accra where in a peak flood event, particularly, you know, depending on tidal variations of the sea level, it could be difficult actually to sort of just let gravity-fed gutters take the water into the sea. It makes sense conceptually, but it's actually more nuanced. And to really and truly solve a problem where you would never have a recurrence, you actually have to introduce active infrastructure. I mean, pumping stations and things like this that can pump water to various other places to higher elevations so that it could descend at other times. So it's not purely a matter of just making the gutters and the drainage more efficient in terms of just letting the water just flow to the sea. I mean, that's the simplistic way of seeing it, but...
Talking about redesigning the infrastructure and architecture of the whole capital, if we're going to adopt that. Or those who live in the flood-prone areas, acknowledging, I think the key point you made, first you need to acknowledge that we have a problem, that this will flood. No matter what you do, we might have some floods, even if you do the drains and you provide other channels, as you said, for the water to go and collect. Possibility is you have one of those events that doesn't conform to the normal rain patterns that we're used to, that will still flood, and therefore redesign the infrastructure.
Exactly. I mean, you have to look at a worst-case scenario and then plan for that, right? So, and again, I mean, when you look at, I love the fact that you brought up the digital terrain model, because this is not new information. I mean, people know the areas that are low. We know the most flood-prone and vulnerable areas. But the question is, does the common layperson have that information? Or is it in a scientific paper or a journal or in a government study or something like this? So I think that educating people and letting them know, so look, these are the risks that are in play, understanding sort of as weather patterns and things are occurring, just to understand, you know, what could be happening so people could be prepared, and also have a plan in place so that when these kinds of things occur, people have a sense of, okay, well, this is what I should do. You know, otherwise, this kind of panic sets in, because this is all of a sudden, you know, devastation is there, and you don't know what you're supposed to do, and to what extent you get that information in a timely fashion can be challenging.
Kingsley, I get the impression that what we heard the president announce that they will do is pretty much taking the simplistic approach to dealing with this without understanding the complexities of this to solve it permanently. Is that your view too?
Well, you know the normal problem with the indigenous, I would say, Ghanaian or the indigenous African solving problems ad hoc.
Let me read to you what he says. He says, first, after talking about the demolition of the structures, it says clearing illegal, okay, that's it, clearing illegal structures, obstructing our waterways, compliance of safety codes, it talks about that, enforcement of our sanitation bylaws, it talks about that, clearings of filth, then commence design of adequate and efficient drainage system, and then construction of or reconstruction of destroyed infrastructure. But I guess the emphasis here is on the design of adequate and efficient drainage system. Is that a simplistic way to deal with this? Because if you listen to DK, simply thinking of pathways for the water to flow into the sea may not be enough.
Well, I agree with what he was saying in the sense that we always looking at the natural way of getting water into the sea. But if we could acknowledge the various flood-prone areas, make adequate provision to mechanize the system, as he was saying, because if you have pumping machines sitting down in times of such disasters, then anytime there should be such a heavy downpour, then those pumps can be activated. But as it is, we don't have anything of the sort, and we're not thinking that way. But for me, to solve some of this problem adequately, we need to reorganize or re-engineer the drainage system, and then get good dams in place to take in the water as the catchment is. As I tell you,
you have a two-pronged approach. Naturally, some of the water will go into the sea. That's their natural end point. But what you're saying is that create other means of collecting this water naturally when they start flowing down from, say, debris, etc.
You know, water behaves quite interestingly. You don't tell water where to go. Water determines where it wants to go. And so we, as surveyors, we could tell where water would want to go.
You can
because
predict,
we can tell you that this is the lowest part of the country. And so if drains have to be designed, this is the way it has to be designed. You see? And so if you just go pulling down structure, that is good. It's an interim solution. What of the catchment? What are you doing about the catchment? Let's identify the catchments. Let us develop adequate drains within the catchment, and then get the major catchment to carry the water or mechanize it as it were, so that we can stop this perennial flooding as we've been having.
Let me break down a bit more. So your suggestion is, and I want to break down to a layman's point of view, that possibly build another dam? Is that what it is?
Yes,
somewhere?
Yes, we need to get a dam.
And deliberately channel the water that is flowing from, say, a Brie upland, some way going to that and collecting it, like we're seeing the Wager Dam, for example, so that then subsequently you can control the spillage.
Yeah, we don't need to channel the water. You don't channel water. It's going to be too expensive. You look at the direction,
the natural flow of the water,
and then you dam it. You open up. Yes, you open up and then dam, so that whatever is coming from, if you look at Sakumono, people in Sakumono will tell you, you'll be there. It might have rained in Adenta or Medina. It wouldn't have rained at Sakumono, but you'll be there and you hear a huge noise with water coming. Yeah. You understand?
The gush of water just running.
I tell you, and if you dare, you
why? Because the water, the gradient that is steep, and so it's coming
all
from
the water coming from Adenta, Medina. I have done an extensive survey. In fact, I was part of the design of the master drain for Tema in Takrady. You see, and I tell you, if you look at the digital terrain model for Accra, you marvel. You see that the water that comes through Odo is not just what we have here. All the way beneath the Kwapin range, all the water is
I've had that experience this week. James, you have something to say?
Evans, I don't know if you've recently driven past the Odo River itself.
Yeah. And in fact, James, you lived in Adabraka.
I lived in Adabraka all my life.
Very close to the Odo.
You know? Yes. So, you see, brilliant constructing storm drains and all that. Yeah. My worry is that if as individuals we do not change our attitude, because if you check, if you don't change,
because you live there,
I live there.
Right?
People throw garbage. If you go to the Odo right now, you see the place is filled with a lot of garbage. So with a poor waste management system and individuals not changing their attitude, we'll still have the floods even if we build the biggest storm drain in Accra. So I think going forward we also need to change our attitude. Be educated.
We'll be talking to a victim who lives very close to the Odo River to get a sense of what they believe themselves can be the solution. Because some say, as you said, you live there, I live there too, so we know what the problem is. Let's talk to the environmentalists. I'll come to you, Diki. I know you've made some points. Let's expand on that when we come back from speaking to Mahama Yarega, who joins us on the telephone line. Hello, Ms. Yarega.
Hi, good evening.
Great. I know you've been touring the country. Where are you now?
Oh, I'm back in Accra.
Back in Accra. You've been observing some of the illegally sited or those filling stations that have failed to meet some of the standards. Now tell me, I think you've ended your tour. Overall, what did you observe that is of concern?
I have not ended my tour.
Okay.
I just came back to Accra because I have other assignments.
So give me a sense
This
of
is
what
going
you've
to be
observed so
an
far.
An ongoing program, and I think that we would not make it a 9 days wonder. We would persist until there's a change in attitude. There are two issues we are discussing. One seems to be on the fuel stations, and the other looks at the broader issues of the management of drainage systems in Accra. So I'll just touch on the two issues, partly in agreement with what most of your panelists have already said, and also to explain what sometimes I think maybe we're all not getting. In the case of the fuel stations, it is true that there are permitting processes, and that if there is proper compliance with the permitting process, we shouldn't be having the problems that we are having. When I say proper compliance, I mean compliance with processes internal to the permitting authority, and also proper behavior by the persons who are constructing the fuel station. One set of situations that I saw relate to where permits were properly obtained, area is suitable for establishing fuel stations, but then you have a maintenance problem, and I think your panelists have discussed the maintenance culture and the issues therein, or the addition of activities that should not go together with the retailing of petroleum products. So that's one set of situations, and for those situations we insisted that they abandoned one set of activities that would endanger the customers who come around to purchase petroleum products. There's a second situation where, yes, proper permitting was done, but if you really look at the place, a third party looking at it would agree that whoever granted a permit ought not to have granted a permit in the first place.
Like this cylinder manufacturing place close to the filling station that you interrogated I think the EPA about.
Precisely. Not just that, there are several places that I've been to here, Kumasi, other places, and you see that you shouldn't have permitted anybody to site a fuel station here. They will cite all sorts of interferences. Yesterday I was in Kumasi, and there's this fuel station by the Islamic secondary school. I mean, you shouldn't have cited a fuel station there or a gas, retail station there. But somehow they were all holding permits. And we just looked at it and asked, look, I mean, they're holding valid permits, but you and I, let's do the analysis. First and foremost, this is a major drainway, and you've gone to fill it with gravel, and even the level at which you have reached is such that anytime it rains, it was definitely flat. And somebody in your studio was talking about the valve systems and the possibility of water getting into the tanks and, pushing the petroleum products out, and that kind of the situation that we saw
play out at Circle
might have caused what happened at Circle. So there are those cases, and there are situations where people just don't have any permit at all, and they're operating fuel stations without any form of permit. So there are all sort of situations. And, you have situations where the area was a residential area, and then somehow the local government authorities miraculously rezone just that one plot into a commercial area to enable somebody to site a fuel station. And very often the residents protested, some of them using their networks within either the security or local government authorities or some other sources, cow down the local community and then forcefully construct fuel stations. I mean, understandably, it is only rich people who can construct fuel stations. Poor people definitely cannot construct fuel stations. So there are those measures. Now let me just get back to the arguments about the president's pronouncements and whether that is the proper approach first and foremost,
Okay, just before we move on to that, my guest would like to ask a few questions about the fuel stations quickly. James?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Mr. Minister, I would like to ask who
Mahama
Yariga, who we should blame for issuing the permits to those filling stations. Is it the individuals or the authorities who are supposed to know better?
All of us, indeed, all of us are responsible. When you look at all the agencies that are involved, I'm talking about the EPA, I'm talking about the NPA, I'm talking about the town and country planning officers who are on the ground, I'm talking about everybody, fire service, everybody who is involved cannot deny culpability in this instance. So I think that the first thing is to be honest and frank and accept responsibility for the mess that we find ourselves in.
Did you have a question?
No, I have a question with the authorities who grant the permit.
Go on.
More often than not, you realize that the victim, let's say the fuel station is pulled down, that is fine, but whoever gave the permit should be fished out. And
absolutely.
That is it. The point is.
He's answering that.
I agree with you that we have planned a national audit, and we're doing this, the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation, Ministry of Petroleum, and then also Ministry of Trade, because the Standards Board is under Trade, NPA is under Petroleum, EPA is under us, Town and Country Plan under us. So we getting a third party to do an audit. If from the audit constantly we can see that a particular regional officer consistently grants permits where clearly the person should not be granting permits, it shows either incompetence or that you are inappropriately influenced at all times to do what you've been doing, and therefore some, penal consequences should follow. And I do agree with you that there must be consequences for our actions, especially those of us in public office.
Okay, you wanted to talk about the announced measures that we had, I think, on Wednesday when he was at the climaxing of the 3 days of mourning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, first and foremost, there are immediate things that need to be done. And those immediate things relate to where people really have built in waterways. We're not yet out of the woods. It could rain heavily tonight, tomorrow, next week. So what do we do? Do we still just sit back and then wait for the rains to stop, and then we start thinking about the long-term things about how do we manage the drains properly? We can't afford to do that. Immediately, we need to look at the various drains and see who is obstructing which drain, and then take immediate action to clear those drains. Because as it is now, because of the heavy rains, the ground is totally soaked. So we cannot count on the ground absorbing some more water when it rains. When it rains now, all the water will be trying to find its way into the sea. And your diagnosis about what structurally is the underlying problem is accurate. That Accra is in a low-lying area, that when it rains, all the water that collects along the Akwapim Range, Eburi, and all those places will be struggling to find their way into the ocean. And as they try to get to the ocean, the waters, of course, will take whatever is along the way. We took the aerial view of Accra for about 30, 40 years. And after every 10 years, if you see the extent to which buildings have been constructed very close to the drains, it's sad. I looked at most of the drains from an aerial view. We have pictures, and you can see that there's a minimum buffer zone and there's a maximum buffer zone. And people have gone beyond the maximum buffer zones, and they are now, in the minimum buffer zones. Some of them have blocked the drains.
So I guess it circles back to the enforcement of the laws and the bylaws that exist. And there's a question for you quickly from DK.
Yeah, Honorable, thank you for joining us. My question is, you've explained that there are some pretty comprehensive plans that have been put in place over the years. Do you personally believe that we can actually bring about these solutions, or should the citizens of Accra resign themselves to future floods on an ongoing basis?
No, I think we can, and those are the long-term measures, and it does cost money, and we need to.
How long term?
Well, it will probably take a couple of years to be able to construct these dams, but the immediate things about desilting the drains can be done immediately. There are other things. You spoke about more open spaces and reducing the volume of concreting of flaws in the city. And now you are very right on that point, that if you look at Accra today, almost every inch of it is now covered with concrete. So the role of the natural process of the ground absorbing the water has been minimized. And so we need to get back to trying to create more open spaces so that people can do more landscaping than covering the place with concrete. Because once you cover with concrete, immediately if the water drops, it is moving. But if it is landscaped, when the water drops, it is retained for a while.
What about doing something radical? Because, cities like Seoul in Korea, for many decades, their rivers were also in concrete and sort of canalized. But now they broke that concrete and they restored it to actually a natural river in the middle of the city. And this is happening in many cities around the world. Do you think there's any chance that in Accra, something at that scale could occur and we could actually restore, for example, the Oda into actually a river again?
The Hydrological Services Department that is responsible for designing and advising on the nature of drains, we are working very closely with them. We've been having long meetings, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We're having long meetings, strategizing to advise the president on some of these long-term measures. I mean, there are new technologies that we could rely on. There are new ideas about how to do this so that we can rely on. But the truth of the matter is that whichever way, you need to have a mix of, measures. One is that you need to maintain, or at least, restore the integrity of the drains. And so the buildings that are so perilously close to the drains that are serving as impediments to the movement of water, we need to address that. Whether or not we took off the concrete, whether or not, in the area. And the truth is that really what you see really has to do with a few areas that have been concretized, but a lot of it really is not concrete. So we need to address those issues. And we need to also look at the management of, domestic used water. That's an area that we haven't really looked at because Accra is much, much bigger now. There are a lot more people living in this part of the country.
I get the impression that whatever we have to do is a pretty complex one. And whatever we've had in the past week or so, it's just the tip of the iceberg, scratches the surface about when it comes to dealing with this problem. But I'm grateful, Mahama Yarega, that you joined us to explain at least what we are doing. We'll talk about shortly the human factor, the factor that James was talking about, the attitudes that had led to this. Mahama, thank you for your time. Mr. Yarega, for your time here on Ghana Connect. What do we do with the Sodom and Gomorrahs, with the Odona slum areas, with the Nima areas, the areas that we know always will flood, the Alajos, the other area here, Veno, they always flood. Most people die there. What do we do with them?
I think, first of all, we don't have to call them that. We can call them Old Fadama, or other names, or Agubloshi. I mean, they have other names. I would say two things. I think, first of all, there's one solution that's very simple, but it will cause some pain to people, so we don't do it. But we need land reform, and we need affordable housing. We need massive investment in affordable housing. People are living there because of economic circumstances. So it's not like they're living there by choice. And there's a lot of inequality that is very deep-rooted. It's entrenched in a lot of kind of legal sort of fine print. And that needs to be overhauled. And I think that if that were done with real dedication and commitment, not only would it transform the lives of tens and hundreds of thousands of people over time, it would also transform the city of Accra overall, even in terms of its economics. This approach. But really much more integrated.
Okay. James, your main problem is the attitude. And when we lived in Adabraka, it was an attitude problem. People will do it in the black polythene bag and throw it. How do you deal with that, though? We've heard about education. We've had that for years. It doesn't change anything.
Enforcement of the laws.
Okay.
Tighter regulations. And also, I think a real good preemptive engineering solutions to divert and create useful waterways to limit the floods and its recurring damages. And also the various stakeholders, town and country planning, and those other EPA should be working together. It looks like they're working like an island. They have separate. They should have a common. They should have a common platform on which they all work together and know what this one is doing, what the other one is doing, then come together and compare.
Some coordination.
Coordination. Yeah.
What's your final thoughts on how to deal with this?
Well, I think that there should be more education.
Education that says what exactly?
That's what at least let the people appreciate that this things like you mentioned should not be thrown into the gutter, but at least should be collected and dumped somewhere, you know. And I think with that, we can make a headway, because the most often policies are made from top to down, but if we make policies down-up approach, I think it's going to help with a lot of things, because if community gatherings or meetings are made and people are conscientized and they are made aware about the adverse effects of some of their do's and don'ts, then they'll begin to appreciate what, and more especially, it should be inculcated, it should be integrated into our curricula, academic curricula, so that the children coming up, because honestly, if you dump something in the gutter and your son tells you, Daddy, what you did, you'll be embarrassed.
Okay.
They should also wake up. They've been sleeping on the job.
Thank you very much, Kingsley, James, and DK for sharing those thoughts over that. And so, that's Nam City. Does it flood?
Oh, I mean, it floods. It's a natural. I mean,
but
it's
doesn't kill anybody. It is designed so that the floods waters will not.
Let's say it's still a work in process. I mean, it's still very early stage in construction. So I mean, the ambition is to be able to put in countermeasures. But I think in the case of Accra, what I would say is that every single person in Accra should plant one tree.
Bottom line. Thank you very much, DK. Thank you very much for connecting with us here on Joy 99.7 FM. If you want to join us again next week, we'll do it again. My name is Evan Spencer.